In a smoke-filled room at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, American officers hunched over a massive game board, moved wooden ships across a painted Pacific Ocean. The year was 1932. They were simulating a Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, 9 years before it actually happened. What they discovered in those war games would prove so accurate, so chilling, that when the real attack came on December 7, 1941, some officers felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. They had played this scenario before. They had lost before. And tragically, the lessons learned in those games were largely ignored. This is the story of how America's military strategists predicted Pearl Harbor with stunning precision, yet failed to prevent one of the greatest disasters in naval history. The United States Naval War College has been the intellectual heart of American naval strategy since its founding in 1884. But it was during the interwar period, between World War I and World War II, that the War College developed something revolutionary. A sophisticated series of war games that would attempt to predict and prepare for the next great conflict. These were not simple board games. They were complex simulations involving hundreds of participants, detailed intelligence assessments, and mathematical calculations that attempted to model real naval combat. The games were played on a massive floor in Pringle Hall, where the Pacific Ocean was recreated in miniature, with every island, every port, every strategic choke point carefully represented. The officers who participated in these games represented the finest strategic minds in the American military. Many would go on to become the admirals who would actually fight the Pacific War. Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner. These men all played the games. They moved the wooden ships. They made the decisions. They lived through simulated disasters and victories. And critically, they played against opponents who thought like the Japanese, who understood Japanese strategic culture, who could anticipate Japanese moves. The games were designed to be brutally realistic. When ships were sunk in the game, they stayed sunk. When resources were depleted, they were gone. There was no reset button, no do-overs. The consequences of bad decisions cascaded through the simulation just as they would in real war. Between 1919 and 1941, the Naval War College played out the war with Japan more than 130 times, and a disturbing pattern emerged. In game after game, the Japanese opened with a devastating surprise attack. Sometimes it was on the Philippines, sometimes on Guam. But increasingly, as Japanese capabilities grew and American intelligence improved, the games began to focus on Hawaii, on Pearl Harbor. The scenario that emerged was terrifyingly consistent. A Japanese carrier task force, operating in radio silence, would approach Hawaii from the north. It would launch a surprise air attack at dawn. The American battleships, moored in neat rows, would be sitting ducks. The attack would be devastating. And in the games, it was. The simulations revealed several critical vulnerabilities. First, Pearl Harbor was a trap. The narrow entrance channel meant that ships hit during an attack would be difficult to save. They could sink and block the harbor entirely. Second, the American military's peacetime routine was predictable. Ships were in port on weekends. Defenses were relaxed. Personnel were at reduced readiness. Third, radar and air patrol coverage had gaps. A determined attacker approaching from an unexpected direction, particularly from the north where weather was poor and surveillance was limited, could achieve complete surprise. And fourth, perhaps most critically, the games revealed that battleships, the pride of the fleet, were vulnerable to air attack in a way that many traditional naval officers simply refused to believe. The man who ran many of these games was Admiral William Sims, a controversial figure who had long argued that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate future naval warfare. His protégés at the War College pushed this theory in game after game. They showed that carriers operating at range could strike first, could sink battleships before those battleships ever saw their attackers. But the battleship admirals, the old guard who had built their careers on big guns and heavy armor, resisted these conclusions. They argued the games were unrealistic, that aircraft were fragile, that anti-aircraft fire was more effective than the simulation suggested. They found reasons to discount the results. But some officers paid attention. Admiral James Richardson, who commanded the Pacific Fleet from 1940 to 1941, was so alarmed by the vulnerability of Pearl Harbor that he repeatedly requested permission to base the fleet in California instead. He argued that Pearl Harbor was a trap, that the fleet was exposed, that it was inviting attack. His requests were denied. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted the fleet in Hawaii as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. Richardson protested so vehemently that he was relieved of command. His replacement was Admiral Husband Kimmel, who would be in command when the actual attack came. In 1932, the War College ran a particularly prophetic game. The scenario had a Japanese carrier force attacking Pearl Harbor at dawn on a Sunday morning. The attack achieved complete surprise. 8 battleships were hit. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. The game umpires calculated that it would take the United States at least 2 years to recover. The officer who played the role of the Japanese commander in that game executed his attack with precision and daring. He understood that surprise was everything, that the attack had to be overwhelming, that there could be no half measures. That officer's name was Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. Wait, no. The American officer played the Japanese role. But years later, it would be the real Admiral Yamamoto who would plan and execute the actual attack on Pearl Harbor, using many of the same principles that had been demonstrated in the American war games. The question that haunts historians is simple. If the Naval War College predicted Pearl Harbor with such accuracy, why was nothing done to prevent it? The answer is complex and tragic. First, there is a difference between knowing something is possible and believing it will actually happen. The game showed that an attack on Pearl Harbor was possible, even likely, but many officers believed the Japanese would not dare such an operation. They thought it was too risky, too bold, too far from Japan's supply lines. Second, the games revealed vulnerabilities, but fixing those vulnerabilities required resources, political will, and organizational change. Installing more radar, increasing air patrols, dispersing the fleet, all of these measures had costs and created complications. In peacetime, with budgets tight, these preparations were delayed. Third, intelligence failed. The War College games assumed near-perfect intelligence about enemy movements. In reality, American codebreakers had made tremendous progress reading Japanese diplomatic codes, but Japanese naval codes remained largely unbroken in 1941. When the real carrier task force sailed toward Hawaii in November 1941, it maintained perfect radio silence. American intelligence lost track of Japan's carriers. They knew something was coming, but they did not know where or when. Fourth, and perhaps most important, there was a failure of imagination at the command level. The warnings were there. The games had shown what could happen, but the officers on the ground in Hawaii in 1941 simply did not believe the attack would come to them. On the morning of December 7, 1941, when the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the attack unfolded almost exactly as the war games had predicted. The carrier task force approached from the north. The attack came at dawn on a Sunday. The battleships were moored in neat rows. Defenses were unprepared. The destruction was catastrophic. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. And in the offices of the Naval War College, officers looked at each other with grim recognition. They had seen this before. They had played this game. They had lost this game. And now it was real. But there is an ironic twist to this story. While the war games had accurately predicted the disaster at Pearl Harbor, they had also prepared the Navy for what came next. The officers who survived the attack, who had to rebuild the fleet and take the war to Japan, were the same officers who had played the games. They knew the Japanese playbook because they had simulated it dozens of times. They understood Japanese strategy, Japanese tactics, Japanese thinking. And critically, the games had taught them that the war would be won by carriers and submarines, not by the battleships that now lay shattered at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz, who took command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, had played the War College games extensively. When he arrived in Hawaii and surveyed the damage, he reportedly said that it could have been worse. The carriers had been at sea. The fuel storage tanks had not been hit. The repair facilities were intact. The Japanese had won the battle, but not the war. And Nimitz knew how to fight back because he had fought this war before, in simulation, in the war games. The Battle of Midway, the decisive American victory that turned the tide of the Pacific War, was fought using principles and tactics that had been refined in the War College games. The island hopping campaign, the submarine blockade of Japan, the carrier task force operations, all of these had been rehearsed and perfected in those smoke-filled rooms in Newport. The story of the Admirals game is a study in both the power and limitations of military planning. The Naval War College got it right. They predicted the attack. They understood the vulnerabilities. They even trained many of the officers who would have to respond to the disaster. But prediction is not prevention. Knowing what might happen is not the same as being able to stop it. The institutional inertia, the budget constraints, the political considerations, the simple human tendency to hope that the worst will not come to pass, all of these conspired to leave Pearl Harbor vulnerable even when the danger was well understood. Today, Military services around the world still use war games to prepare for future conflicts. The technology has advanced tremendously. Computer simulations can model warfare with incredible detail, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you convince people to prepare for disasters they hope will never occur? How do you overcome the natural human optimism that says it will not happen here, it will not happen now, it will not happen to us? The officers at the Naval War College did their job. They saw the future. They warned their superiors. But in the end, on that quiet Sunday morning in December, the warnings were not enough. The game became real. And America learned, in fire and blood, that the admirals had been right all along.